story here. President Trump's decision to deploy federal forces to major cities across the country to fight crime. It's being criticized as a political move meant to boost his re-election campaign.
When the President of the United States starts to use federal officers like his own personal police force, that's very dangerous for our democracy.
Mayor de Blasio, Governor Cuomo, and Brooklyn District Attorney Eric Gonzalez challenging the Trump administration every step of the way. DA Gonzalez actually joins us live right now this morning. So good morning to you, sir. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you for having me today.
Hey, thank you for joining us. So what was the initial reaction that you had, sir, when you first heard about this plan to flood cities that are seeing spikes in crime, something the president says he can help get under control with his current plan?
Well, we saw what happened in Washington, D.C. when federal troops were put out to push away protesters, and we're watching very carefully what's happening in Oregon. We know that sort of federal surge, as he's calling it, is not designed to keep people safe. It's actually designed to take away criticism for his response to the COVID crisis across this country.
Yeah, and when you look at some of this video, I mean, we saw federal forces arrive in camouflage and arrest a number of people in Portland, including the mayor, who then actually protested on the streets. Now, the plan is to expand to other cities, right? Including Chicago, Albuquerque, possibly New York City. However, the governor says that's not going to happen. So are there legal steps to challenge this and actually stop it?
Well, the mayor said, and I'm sure we're going to challenge any sort of deployment in federal court. The United States Code does allow for us to take, action in court to prevent this kind of deployment. What we want to say to the president is we understand our communities. We have had a worrisome uptick in crime, and we're on top of it. We're going to drive it down. Sending in troops who are violating people's civil rights is not going to be a solution to fighting crime. It's actually going to create more chaos like it did in Portland.
Yeah, in fact, the top prosecutor in Philadelphia said he would actually go as far as arresting those federal officers if they actually come into the city and commit crimes like shooting people with rubber bullets or kidnapping people, as they call it. So do you have thoughts on this if it were to happen in New York?
Well, I spoke to the DA in Philadelphia and Baltimore and other places about this. The U.S. Code would allow a state prosecutor to initiate charges. Most of those cases would then be sent to federal court. So under the Trump administration, we would sort of be stymied, I believe, but under a new administration, and obviously charges can be deferred until after the election, I think they would be possibly jeopardy for anyone who came into a city and committed a crime. I mean, any law enforcement officer must still follow the law.
Right.
It does not matter if they're a federal officer.
So, President Trump, the root cause of why he's doing this, he says that the move is a direct response to what he calls a surge in gun violence in major cities. We're seeing that play out here in New York City. Do you feel that the recent steps to reform the NYPD have actually given the criminal the upper hand here?
Well, we know that the police commissioner has said that about 20 people were responsible for many of the shootings in Brooklyn. We know who those people are, and we're going to get them off the streets. We're going to work very closely with our community to help identify these shooters, and we're going to take them to court, and we're going to indict them and take them off the streets.
You point out in an op-ed in the Daily News yesterday that I read this morning that the social conditions from COVID lockdown is a contributor here, that people have been pent up, under stress, traumatized, have jobs have disappeared, all combined with this delay in trials at the courts. Do you feel that you can actually compare crime numbers month to month and year to year under these historic conditions that we're currently in?
I sort of lost you, but in terms of what we're seeing on the ground, I do believe that some people feel emboldened to commit crime. It's important that we take proactive steps. Our grand juries are expected to come back at the end of this, the beginning of August, and we intend to prioritize the people who are the drivers of crime. And it should be noted that there's really just a small number of people driving the violence in places like Brooklyn. We know who they are. We're going to go after them. The average person in New York City, the majority of our community are law-abiding and want to live in peace and harmony.
And I want to get into this because there's this idea that gun arrests aren't happening or that this release of criminals from Rikers is to blame. We've heard that from the NYPD many times here on PIX11, that courts are being slow to process because of the pandemic. Do you see these as issues for a rise in crime as a contributing factor here?
The pandemic has created tremendous amount of stress, trauma, and anger. And as these shootings have played out in our community, and no one has been arrested or prosecuted, there's more retaliation to those shootings. So the most important thing we can do is to work very closely with our courts to make sure that we get the courts fully open, our grand jury open, and we indict these cases so that we can get these folks off the streets.
You know, the NYPD has said that oftentimes that the reducing jail numbers is actually something they don't agree with, putting people back on the streets. In your op-ed, you said, "I'm committed to reducing jail and convictions as the response to most crimes and focusing the resources of my office on identifying, prosecuting the small number of people who are the drivers of violent crime." What are your conversations like with the police commissioner about that issue?
Well, we've sat down. Actually, I sat down with the police commissioner 2 days ago, and we're going through who our drivers of crime are. We understand who they are. We know who they are. And now we're building our cases to make sure that they can be held accountable and off the streets. The people of Brooklyn don't want sweeps. We don't want federal surges. We don't want to go back to an overuse of stop and frisk.
Right.
We want fairness in our justice system, but we also demand that the people who commit violence be held accountable and stop the violence. And we're going to do our part to get them off the street.
And lastly, sir, while I have you here, I do want to get your take on what NYPD brass have been saying about the recent chokehold bill. They've been saying they feel it actually works against them in terms of doing their jobs, puts them at a disadvantage, and that it could prevent them from making arrests on the streets because they don't want to put their knee on somebody's back. Your take on this? They have gone forward saying that they don't want to be arrested. Would you prosecute an officer who had the knee on someone's back if it warranted it, if it was a violent struggle?
Every case will have to be analyzed. There are two laws. What the state passed, which is a chokehold law, and it's a ban on the use of neck compression, and that's a classified C felony. And then the city council passed a bill that the police department have been calling it's called a chokehold bill, but the police department has been calling it a diaphragm bill. And that's where the concern is, could an inadvertent maneuver, not an intentional maneuver, but an inadvertent maneuver by a police officer fighting for their life lead to prosecution. And we believe that the penal law 3510, the issue of justification, must always be considered in every case. So there'll be case-by-case determinations, and I understand that the unions are suing in court to prevent that law from being applied. So we'll find out soon.
District Attorney, I appreciate your time this morning. It's been a while since we chatted. You are welcome back anytime to talk about the issues. Thanks for waking up.
Thank you for having me. All right, bye.
Of course.